are you ready? Okay, if you're ready, I'm ready. Kate, are you ready? That's right.
No, but I would.
How many do we have to have for a quorum?
10. Let's press this one.
That's right. See how pretty we look up there?
Stay seated there.
Oh, I know.
I have it now. This is how I stay organized.
So you have your little subcommittees for
No, this indication. Sure.
And we had 2 or 3 folks that showed up.
You're running. Okay, we're going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. I apologize, we're a few minutes late. But before we get started, I'd like to go ahead and thank NBU staff and leadership for being here. I'd like to thank all the committee members for making time today. Individually, I'd like to thank Councilmember Willis for his attendance today, right over here. And then I think we have Board of Trustees, Wayne Peters is somewhere in the room back there. So thank him for being here as well. Okay, if you would, let's stand. We'll do the Pledge of Allegiance, and then Stuart Blythen will lead us in the invocation. Do we have a flag? We're going to pledge allegiance to the flag. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state under God, one and indivisible.
Let us pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, we give thanks for this day. We give thanks for the cooler weather. We give thanks for the opportunity to bring us together and the privilege to serve this community. We pray that as we move forward with our duties and our assigned tasks, that we do so in a way that is good for the community, is good for all members of our community. And furthermore, Father, we pray that the work is pleasing to you. We pray this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. Mr. Avery, I apologize. I had you listed on here. I did not see that.
We could do that again.
We'll have you on the December 7th meeting. Bobby Avery will do the invocation then. Okay, for some housekeeping, public comment will be our next section. The purpose of the Rate Advisory Committee is for its members, for members of the Rate Advisory Committee to use the 2022-2023 cost of service and rate design study to devote the necessary time and energy to learn about the utility business, understand and provide its insights, perspectives, and feedback to NBU management and Board of Trustees about the upcoming rate design for water, wastewater, and electricity utility services. The Rate Advisory Committee feedback and insights shall be focused on NBU's rate structures, cost recovery from customers, and integration of community values while considering industry standards and NBU's financial health and stability. The New Braunfels Utilities Rate Advisory Committee welcomes and encourages the public to attend its meetings and asks that any member of the public wishing to speak should come to the microphone and state his or her name and address. For items that are not posted on this agenda today, the NBU Board of Trustees or the NBU Rate Advisory Committee may not deliberate on any item that is not posted on the agenda. For such an item, NBU 1 or the NBU Rate Advisory Committee may make a statement of fact regarding the item, make a statement concerning the policy regarding the item, or propose that that item be placed on a future agenda. For items posted on this agenda, the public may provide comments during the public comment period or during the board's consideration of the posted item. Please approach the podium, state your name and address, and limit your comments to no more than 3 minutes. We will limit public comment to a total of 30 minutes. In addition, no personal attacks on employees, members of the Rate Advisory Committee, and/or NBU Board of Trustees will be tolerated. If anyone expresses any personal attacks, you will receive a warning, and if these attacks persist, you will be asked to leave. NBU is managing an active citizen input process, and as leaders of this committee, we have requested to be kept fully updated and informed of that effort and any outcomes. Okay, so at this time, we'll open it up for public comments. If we have any members of the community that would like to speak, please approach the podium, state your name and address, and limit your comments to 3 minutes or less. Seeing no mad dash, we will move to the next item. So opening comments from the chair. The main thing that I want to remind everybody is about the lanes that we're working on, the priority lanes. And so if your committee has not met, somebody on your committee, take leadership and get that committee moving forward. If you need help, Jill with NBU will help navigate that. I have heard from 3 different lanes, if you will, on those priority processes and questions. And so there is some communication that is ongoing, but if others are meeting, I haven't been made aware of it at this point. But we do have a deadline of December the 12th because we want to be able to put whatever your priorities are and whoever's going to be speaking to those from your lane, we want to put those in the presentation for the 14th. Does anybody have any questions on those subcommittees? Seeing none, we will go ahead and read the presentation items, and then we will open the floor for presenters. Presentation items. Presentation from NBU Chief Executive Officer, Frieza Nichols Incorporated and New Gen Strategies and Solutions, LLC. A, NBU revenue projections and future budgets. B, review of cost of service rate process. And then there's 3 subcategories: functionalization of costs by operational area, classification of costs by cost driver, allocation to customer classes. C, review of water utility projections. I, projected operating results. Number 2, projected cost of service results. Item D, or bullet D, review of wastewater projections. And then the subcategories are projected operating results and projected cost of service results. And then item E will discuss the content and goal of our next meeting, which will be held on December 7th, 2022 at 3 p.m. And with that, Mr. Taylor, are you okay?
Good afternoon. I want to thank you all on behalf of the Board of Trustees and all of us here at New Braunfels Utilities for the time that you continue to volunteer in these meetings, and also your subcommittee meetings, which I know you have spun up and started participating in. So thank you all for that very much. Just want to make 2 comments to you. One, last time before we kicked off the Rate Advisory Committee meeting, I kind of gave you this, let's keep in mind the forest so we don't get lost in the trees kind of talk. It's helpful for me too, just as I've gone through this, to keep in mind we're a big picture where we're going, because as we get into the details of the slides, I think sometimes it can get easy to get caught up in, wait, where are we now? So I'll share some thoughts on that. And then after that, I have 2 updates related to the industry and just some local stuff that's been happening. So going to the first topic, at the last Rate Advisory Committee meeting, we showed you financial statements for each line of business: water, wastewater, and electric, each of those 3 utilities. And at the end of it, there was this percent that was represented to show how much percent increase would be required in revenue for each of those utilities to break even, and then also meet those financial ratios that we shared with you that were required for our financial policy and therefore our bond rating. The chair of this committee has been very helpful. Justin Meadows has been very helpful in advising us as we put together these presentations. Hey, when you kick off the next meeting, it might be helpful to revisit some of these items there's some questions or just to clarify, get everybody's mind back where we were. So we're going to lead off with that. I think it's a great idea. So we're going to pull up those statements and go through those just so we can pick up where we left off last time. If I can make a comment about those numbers, the numbers that are in those years, so we have fiscal year 23 and then the 4 years that follow, that is within what's NBU's current approved budget for fiscal year 23 and also our 5-year financial operating plan. Both of those are developed at the same time, presented to the Board of Trustees at the same time, and approved at the same time. So there's a budget for the year we're in and the 5-year financial operating plan. Our fiscal year begins August 1st, and that budget and 5-year plan is approved in June annually. What we've done this year is accelerated all those dates. And so we have staff working real hard to accelerate this year that budget approval, which we're going to take to the Board of Trustees in March so that we can have the most accurate numbers possible for this rate plan that we're putting together. So my point in telling you that is I don't anticipate the numbers changing much from what you're seeing, but we will show you those final numbers. The idea is let's get the most accurate numbers we can because, as you know, things are changing very quickly right now. We're in a state of flux with interest rates doing what they're doing, inflation, and then their impact on growth, which is a big driver for our business. So just wanted to share that with you to keep that in mind. As we go through the presentation today, what we're going to do is we're going to take all those costs that you saw last time and we're going to run them through what Freeze and Nichols has done for wastewater. We'll show you this time. We'll do the same thing for electric next time. There's this process of categorizing those costs, and the point of that is to get to one of the last slides in the presentation, which shows you how those costs should be applied to each customer type based on which customer types are driving those costs and the degree to which they're driving those costs. So there's always, no matter what utility you're in, there's some type of subsidization between customer types, and you're going to see that at the very end. But that's where the presentation ends. Next time we'll do electric, and we'll end at the same type of information. Then the next step is rate design. So what do you do with that information, right? So we're going to end with that today, and the next time we'll pick up where we left off there. And just to keep in mind, what we're doing here is the same thing as what an investor-owned for-profit utility would do. It's just that there's no rate of return built into it. That's the piece that we don't have that they do have. And then finally, just 2 updates related to the local topics and the industry we're in. This past Monday at City Council approved NBU's impact fee update. As you recall, those are for water and wastewater. The impact fees, as they're presented to the board and approved by council, they follow a philosophy that NBU's Board of Trustees have taken, which is development pays for development, and new development costs are not included in rates. That's one of the policy items that one of your subcommittees is taking up. In fact, one of the questions Monday night from the dais is, what happens if you take some of those costs out of impact fees and put them into rates? And Dawn's accounting team worked very quickly. I saw the outcome of that today, just about an hour ago. So we have that information, not for you today, but we do and will provide that to you down the road if that's something that you're interested in. We can certainly show it to you. And then the final topic, more of an industry topic, just an update on what's happening in the ERCOT market right now. If you look at any customer's bill from NBU, if they have electric, water, and wastewater, about 70% of that whole bill, and it depends on how much they're watering lawn, that kind of thing, but roughly 70% of a customer bill with all 3 lines of service is the power that we buy through the ERCOT market. You'll recall that in 2021, after Winter Storm Uri, the legislature passed a bit of legislation that went to the Public Utility Commission of Texas to implement, and that's being done there. And then the PUC regulates ERCOT, the nonprofit grid operator, and market, the market operator. So there are 2 phases of electric market design reforms that the PUC is working on. They've completed phase 1. Phase 2 is now in play, and they have announced what those options could be, and we are evaluating those, and we anticipate by this summer that we'll all have a pretty good idea of where the PUC is going to land with that phase 2 market design. And as you'll recall, the PUC has publicly prioritized reliability over price, whereas in the past it was let's go for low price as the priority. All of that is making the cost of electricity higher in ERCOT, and something that we're watching very closely with those phase 2 market reforms. After last summer, prior to last summer, we had brought in a consultant to an energy expert to do a full-blown comprehensive review of our power supply program, and they're complete. They've completed that work. So they presented their results to the Board of Trustees last month, and they're going to present those to City Council tomorrow night, Thursday evening. So it's going to be a third-party independent look at our power supply program to give an idea of their opinion of how we do our work and areas where they see us able to improve. So if anybody's interested in that, I encourage you to please either watch the council meeting online or come by or watch the recording at some point, because I think it's going to be, it'll help inform the work that you all are doing. So anyway, those are the end of my remarks. Thank you again for your time on this committee. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you again, as Ed, for coming out here again today to devote your time. Appreciate it very much. What we're going to do, as was mentioned, and Justin helped us out with this, actually, just in talking through things that have come up and discussions y'all have had, and we're going to go kind of step back for a second, back to the last presentation that we had last month. Just bring everybody up to speed on, we talked about some factors. We talked about factors that are used, financial factors, ratios that are used in making decisions as we're going through this process, making decisions just in setting up the budget. We're going to kind of review that. If y'all remember last time, we came down with the overall, what does each utility need in order to be whole now through the next 5 years. So we're going to look at that really quickly again, and then we'll move into what we're all talking about, the cost of service and where we're going with everything. So that's the goal today, is what we'll get out of this. And again, just backing up, we talked a lot about policies and targets, what we're doing with that, what they are for NBU right now, just to bring everybody back to what we're trying to accomplish with this whole process, the rate study, cost of service process. Our goal in this is, one, to figure out what it is that NBU needs to operate and be whole at the end of the day, and then who needs to pay for that? How do we recover those costs? So we're here to make sure we recover the costs at the end of the year, okay? NBU has to do that. They have to make enough money to operate, to serve customers. And the decision's been made, we're gonna do that individually by utility. So every utility is gonna pay for itself. That's our two goals there. We're not here, NBU's not here to make a profit. It's not what it does, it's not the goal, it's not what they're tasked to do. When we're going through this process, we do have the financial targets, the policies, the decisions that were made. Those are not being addressed through this study. Those targets, the ratios we talked about last time, those have been set by the board. They've been set through the budgeting process. They're not being set. They're not being moved around through this process. They are what they are. The board has set those. We're just working off of those. We're working off of some of those. However, when we look through this and we go through, they are not, as a whole, driving the answers. And I'll show you in a minute. We'll look at the result sheets that y'all saw last time, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. But those are policies and targets. They drive the budget. So NBU staff uses those targets to set the budget. We're not using those policies. We're not using those targets for the most part to get our answers here. So as I'll walk through that, I'll show you what I'm talking about. And we had, if y'all remember, there were just a few. The key ones, the days cash on hand. We had the debt service coverage and debt to cap ratios there. And those are really the key ones that affect the budgeting process as a whole for what we're doing. Really the key on that, the days cash on hand, is just how much cash we have that's not earmarked for something else, unrestricted funds. That's probably the driver from a reserve standpoint in this process right here. The other ones, the debt to cap ratio, the debt service coverage, that does affect it. It doesn't in our case as we're doing this because debt service coverage ratio never came into play. We didn't have to address it because we were fine. So really the reserve standpoint is the only driver that we used in this process. Everything else was done in the budgeting. This is what we had to take into account here. And the key ones here were the Power Stabilization Fund. From the electric side, we had that target of 365 days for cost of power. A few reasons to do that on these whole things for Power Stabilization Fund and just reserves as a whole. Mitigate risk, don't know what's coming up, easily come up with things. As we saw last year, things happen. We need to be prepared for that. That's the purpose of reserves, to be prepared for that, financially be prepared for that. It does look stronger from an NBU standpoint. It looks stronger out in the market as we're borrowing funds. Help minimize costs, interest rates, those type of things. Those are lower. Then Winter Storm Uri, key example of why reserves are important, being able to react to things like that. Contingency fund, the same thing. Those drove some of the answers because we did target, again, set by the board, but we're targeting 120 days of operating costs. Did that on electric, water, and wastewater. Those were the key factors that were taken into account during this process, during this study. Was just the reserves were the only thing that we addressed. Yes.
Does anybody have any questions about this particular, because you're going to see this again.
Yes, you will.
In future presentations, a very important slide. So if anybody has any questions or comments about that, I would say, let's get those out there before too terribly long.
I have a question. If you go back to that slide, the 300, I think you may have just alluded to the fact that the 365 days is an aggressive approach for reserves. The difficulty I have is we had a once-in-a-lifetime storm, but we managed to pay, we managed to take out short-term debt, pay it off, and now we're in the process of building our reserves again. So clearly there was a process that worked. It was expensive, but we got there when we got through it. So the question that I have as a community-owned utility, does it make sense for the community as a whole to take out a year's worth of money in our local economy so that it sits in a reserve for NBU when we know that times are challenging? Everything's more expensive. Let's say we get another once-in-a-lifetime storm. Well, we do what we just did. We take out a short-term debt. We use the reserves that we have. So my question is, how did we go? And I get it's an easy explanation to say that it's been a year's worth of. We went through a year's worth of expense in 1 week. So that makes sense. But if we looked at it from both perspectives.
It's a great question. We've been talking about this quite a bit internally, and you're right. The 365 is a number that came out of the actual event that occurred February 2021. Years worth of power supply costs in 1 week. What we're working on right now, what we plan to pursue, is an analytical method for approaching it, what that optimized number is, based on everything you just said. So the Energy Authority is the firm that we brought in to do an evaluation of our program. And we're looking for them to provide a scope of services to us to provide that type of statistical analysis to show us what is that right target. So just to put this in perspective, the original plan was to have that power stabilization fund filled in 2030. Well, the cost of power has gone up. So if we assume the cost of power is going to be what it is right now, that would actually be 2031. So the amount that's on a residential electric bill right now, I believe it's $16 for average residential, a little less than $16. That drops this summer on August 1st to be $9 a month. So the plan would then be from August 1st on out to be $9 a month on an average residential electric bill. So there's a number to hold on to, right? I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Just hang on to that number. The $100 million line of credit, so to speak, that we have right now, if we didn't draw down any of that money, so we're not paying any interest on what we've drawn down, the cost to the utilities to have that line of credit available is $1.5 million a year that we just pay to have availability to that, right? And the fact that we got as quickly as we did after Winter Storm Uri was remarkable, how we had to go through that process to get that. So these are all things that we need to balance. I'm not saying what answer is right or wrong. Those are just some numbers to keep in mind as we go through this, but absolutely something that we need to zero in on and figure out what that right number is. Yeah, thanks for asking.
obviously we had, 90 days prior to Winter Storm Uri? Something along those lines was the,
Correct.
and then now we're looking at 365. This rate advisory committee can give a recommendation based on what we've learned, and if we're going to have any presentation about what the consultant brought forth, we could give a recommendation of some other number.
That's right.
As representatives of the community between 90 and 365.
That's right. Absolutely. That's right. That's right. So it'll go to the board, then it'll go to council.
Well, it would also be interesting just to see what and I, looking at how NBU handled those costs, I think y'all did a wonderful job, especially taking out the short-term note, having the reserves already in place that we did have. I think that was great. But it would be nice to know as we look at this too, how other utilities that, and I know you kind of have a competitive set that you look at, how they've pivoted and changed to kind of, with the new world, the new view that we have, what are they doing? And I know that bond rating is important to us, and I know that we rank high compared to other municipal utilities. But, just finding that balance of what makes sense for our community, but also what makes sense for NBU as an entity.
Yeah, that's absolutely. Couldn't agree more with the benchmark comment too. Yeah, and the relationships we have with public power entities, it's terrific. I mean, we all have this great. I mean, we're all community owned, right? So it's a great benchmark to look into. We will bring that to you. Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
One more question, one more thought on the reserves, and also to have an idea in context of what the trigger is for those reserves to be used. Is it just something like Winter Storm Uri, or is it something we could have used this past summer when everybody was, hurting so much, and maybe we didn't have the reserves because we hadn't had a chance to build them up? But I think it'd be helpful for the community too to have like some clear guidelines of when those reserves would be triggered and used.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Let me make a comment about the summer. You're exactly right. Every utility has a variable portion of their electric bill, and it covers volatility in the market. Some call it a fuel charge, PCRA, whatever. It's the same purpose. It's covering volatility, right? When Winter Storm Uri hit, we liquidated all that we had for this part of the business. There is the Power Stabilization Fund. I will point out, though, that this is it's not necessarily a reserve fund, but it's more of, we talked about this internally, it's more, how you keep a certain balance in your checking account so you're not overdrawn? Well, some utilities handle that volatility by changing it once a year. Austin's a great example of that. So they're in a position right now, and if you've been following the news, they're in a position where they're burning cash because the rate that they're collecting revenue at for their power supply is less than their power supply cost because the market's gone up, and they can only change that once a year. That'll go to the city council, I believe. I think they just went through in this past month. San Antonio, for example, they do the exact opposite. Every month, they're recovering exactly what the volatility was. So there's a lot of volatility in their electric bills. What NBU does is somewhere in between. It's interesting. I talked to my counterparts at both utilities about the different models for how to do that. What NBU does and what the board has said over time is there's a band for over and under collection month to month. It's kind of like maintaining a particular balance in your checking account so you're not overdrawn. Well, had we not liquidated all those funds with Winter Storm Uri, we would have been able to cushion the impact of the market changes this summer, because if there was an over-collected position, we could have drawn that down. But it's important to point out that those bands at upper and lower are set by the Board of Trustees, because we will not hang on to funds that we don't need, right? It's just there to lower the volatility and pick the best way to manage that, whether it's to the north where it's changing once a year, which is, may not be enough, or to the south, which is every single month, and you have a highly volatile electric bill month to month. So absolutely, we can share all that with you.
These are all very important comments. The one thing that we do have to always remember, though, is we have to break even.
Yes.
In the cost of service, and we have to mitigate risk. The question is to what extent?
Correct. Yes.
So as we look through all these wastewater and water slides today, just keep that in mind as you look at the numbers. Break even, mitigate risk.
Thank you.
A power stabilization fund or contingency reserve, is the only way to replenish it either to overcharge for the customer for what we purchased, or to supplementally charge them a one-time fee or a monthly fee on their bill? Is there any other method to replenish?
So as it stands right now, and we'll take each fund separately, the power stabilization fund, that has historically been built into that variable piece of the electric rate month to month. And we've always had that cushion in there so we're not overdrawn. And if that power stabilization, so here's an example. In the lead up to Winter Storm Uri, that year before, Dawn had identified risk in the electric market that was greater than what we had normally seen. And because of that, she recommended, as a CFO, recommended to the board that we increase the amount in that power stabilization fund. So that's what we did. In the lead up to Winter Storm Uri, we increased that variable amount so that we can build that up. So that's the method that we have today for doing that. There is no mechanism that we have. The contingency fund, which is to handle risk outside of power supply, just everything else, floods and other events, that is built into the rates. And you'll see that. You'll see that in the statements. But those are the mechanisms. Have I missed any, Don, or confirmed?
From my understanding, is it safe to summarize what you just said is kind of more reserves equals less volatility in the consumer's rates? Is that?
Yeah, yes, yes, especially for power supply, because that is the volatile commodity that we're buying month to month. Everything else is pretty well set. You know, things go up, chemicals for water treatment and that type of thing. It's that commodity market that makes the customer bills volatile. It's a good way of summing it up. Appreciate your questions.
All right, thanks for those. That is key. Justin, thanks for slowing it down for a second, pointing that out, because as y'all pointed out, as Ian pointed out, power stabilization funds specifically for power cost. The other contingency funds, O&M operating reserves, specifically for everything but power cost. So we talk about what they can be used for. Yeah, those are very, very specific that way, then. It's an important distinction. Now I want to look at actually what you saw last time, the operating results for each utility. And just what we want to do with this is just point out the line items basically that are driven by these ratios, these targets that we've talked about and everything. These are not going to match exactly to what you saw last time. And they just point out here the reasons for that. All we did was on this for the water side, just move some things around. I separated some costs here just so they would show differently. City transfers, you saw that on the electric side. They were also in the water and the wastewater. However, they were buried under another cost. They were buried under expense allocation. So we just separated those, moved city transfers into another area. What that did, because of where that moved from a line item, it was up here above debt. Now city transfer sits down here below debt. What that did is adjust your debt service coverage a little bit, raised your debt service coverages. So you're just going to see those little differences. Same bottom line number as what you saw last time. Just some of the numbers, debt service coverage there on line 13. That's a little different from last time. Bottom number on line 20 is the same thing. So nothing really different, the overall picture. But what I want to show from just a ratio standpoint and the way that we've set this up, the way this has been designed and the process for this, really the only drivers from a water standpoint, and then also same thing from a wastewater side. If you remember the three things we had, debt cap ratio, debt service coverage, then really operating reserves is what that is, days on cash on hand. Line for this, line 17, that contingency reserves. is the only thing in this process that we really set. We set that at 120 days. So that is a set target. And for this year, you see the differing on line 17, the differing numbers. All that is doing is moving to maintain that balance at 120 days of our operating. So that is a target that we set in this one. Debt service coverage, it just fell out the way it does. If it had gotten too low, we would have had to work toward that number then, but we didn't have to in this process. So it wasn't a factor. Nothing else was a factor except for the reserve setting on line 17. And then we had the same thing on the wastewater side. We did the same thing on that, separating the city transfers and the allocations. So again, it changed debt service coverage a little bit. Another thing we did on the wastewater side is we relooked at some of the customer data, reallocated some of the customer data on the way it was set up. And what it actually did was increase our sales revenue. So we lowered the required rate increases from what we had last time for what you saw. So this was just from reallocating some of the volumes across the system there. So we had the change on city transfers, changed our debt service coverage, but then we reallocated volume. So we ended up gaining some revenue on that. No. The city transfer is actually funds that are going from the utility just for being able to use city roads, that type of thing. So it's payment to the city, payment in lieu of taxes. So, and there's a formula every year, and the city actually, or NBU actually has a formula that they go through and it presents it. It says, here's the number this year based upon the formula. Here's what we're transferring. So it is driven by formula.
I don't know about these microphones. They go on, they go off, they go on, they go off.
I think if you pull it closer, it'll stay on. There's a little lag before it turning on, but
MCA recording artists. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that city transfer goes back, I think it's part of the charter agreement. Maybe it's not, but it goes back a long way. That's been something that NBU and the city have been doing for decades.
Since 1942,
Yeah.
when NBU was established. Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, every municipal utility has built into their municipal utility rates some type of amount that goes into the city's general fund, correct? Every city does it. Most municipal utilities in the state of Texas are under the city manager, under city council. They're not under a board of trustees. And in that case, they're controlled by council year to year. Those rates are set and change more frequently in some cases. So it's baked in that way. For utilities like us that are under a board of trustees, there is typically some type of calculation. So we have one, the others within Texas that are under a board, they typically have some type of stated calculation. And yes, it was in the ordinance that the city commission wrote when they created the board of trustees. It is still in there today. What makes New Braunfels unique from some of the others is that Richard's right, it's a percent of revenues, and there's a percent that is specific to each utility, each line of business. Electric has a percent, water has one, wastewater has one. But what's unique about NBU is that it takes the revenues, but it removes from the revenues all revenue from power supply, everything bought in ERCOT, and all purchased water. And then what's left over, that percent is applied to. So for example, if you were following the news this summer, you saw in San Antonio that the city of San Antonio had a significant increase in revenue coming from CPS Energy because energy prices were so high. Well, in San Antonio, the calculation that CPS Energy must perform includes the cost of electricity, it includes the cost of power. And when power prices go up, that makes the transfer to the city higher, which is why that was a topic of discussion for the San Antonio City Council this summer. We don't have that in New Braunfels. That's been removed from it. I believe the total percentage, I'm not going to get it exactly right. It's about 7% for electric and about 4.5% for water and 4.5% for wastewater of net of gross revenues minus purchased water minus purchased power.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to make sure for those that may not be familiar with the city transfer term, I just didn't want anybody thinking it was something that was new.
It's not new, and if I could I don't want to speak on behalf of the city, but it's a zero-sum thing. So if for some reason that were to go away, then those revenues are gone from the city. And so the city has to find a way to make that up through taxes or some other way. It's about $10 million a year right now, if I'm not mistaken, and that's a significant portion of the city's budget. Thanks.
As Ian mentioned, you see it, different cities, different things. It said payment in lieu of taxes. That's literally what it is. Instead of paying taxes, there's a fee for it, or city transfer, street rental fee. Depends on the city, but it all represents the same thing.
And the water and wastewater, the impact fees collected under the other operating revenues or non-operating revenues, that's where it falls?
Yes, sir.
And these projections include the recent increase in impact, or the increase that's going to occur in February?
Right, yes, sir. So again, as we're going through this, and that's what you see, we just had the separation, and you can see now on line 15, it's actually a line item, the city transfer. So we've broken it out. It was up above and buried in line 6, that non-operating expenses. So it was in there, broke it apart, brought it down below debt service, or what we would call below the line, changed the calculation for debt service, increase our debt service coverage number a little bit, so it actually helps the way that's done. But it does the same thing. And then from a ratio, from a target standpoint, financial target standpoint, on these, the only thing that we targeted is at line 16 there, contingency reserves. And that, again, is 120 days of our operating expenses. Other than that, none of the other financial targets, none of the ratios are involved in this process here. They're all addressed in the budgeting process. Board has approved that, flows through once the budget is approved. Isn't taken into account when we're doing this process here. Yes, sir. You usually go between 90 days to up to 6 months. No, remember, I said it's to maintain that fund balance. Yes, sir. That's all this is doing, is maintaining that balance at that.
I got you.
Sorry if I didn't make that clear in the first. That was on me.
On line 23 and 24, the percentages, what is that really telling us?
With line 23 and 24, what that is if we do the required rate increase each year, then that's the rate increase needed for that year. So if the prior year, whatever rate increase, so you see in 24, it's showing a 2.11% increase is what's needed. So then 25 is assuming that we implemented the 2.11% increase. And then so on for 26, 27, it's assuming we did the prior 2 years and then the prior 3 years rate increases. So that's how those are done. And then on the bottom one, line 24, it's just kind of a smoothing. Instead of having it being so up and down, the peaks and valleys on that, it's just trying to smooth the rate increases out to get to the same end result.
Sorry, I know we were encouraged to not get mired down in the details, but I can't help myself. If I'm understanding correctly, the contingency reserves are a reflection of the projected operating costs. It's linear with projected operating costs.
Yes, sir.
The projected water operating costs increased 26% from 23 to 27, but wastewater is 128%. And just not understanding this, I would expect those to be more closely correlated. Is there a reason for that difference?
Just the difference in cost for different materials, cost for different chemicals, electricity, such like that, different operating expenses between running treatment plants and between the water and the wastewater side. So they are not linear. There's nothing that ties those together other than the customers from that standpoint.
I believe within that period of time, we're expanding the McKenzie wastewater treatment plant. So it's, instead of just an incremental increase of what we're already operating, we'll be bringing on additional capacity to the treatment plant, which increases the incremental O&M costs. Because you have chemicals, you have electricity for the blowers and that type of thing.
Understood, thanks.
You bet.
These are projected costs. How often are these things reviewed?
Every year. So they're reviewed in the budget annually, so on redoing the projections. And then you'll notice then actually that NBU tracks them monthly on projected to actuals.
So I was getting at the very beginning. What you're seeing right now, these numbers were approved in our budget, and cameras on the way, in the 5-year financial operating plan in June by our board. Instead of waiting all the way till June, we've moved that date up. So we're going to approve the next budget and 5-year plan in March. We're not going to approve it. We're going to present that to the board for their approval in March, so that when we have the final rates, it's going to have the most up-to-date assumptions about costs and that type of thing.
And then this is also where the operating the reserve funds come into, because you don't always hit it dead on. So this is where having those operating reserves, the 120 days operating reserve, gives you the opportunity to take some of the sting out of it. If costs do go up, electricity cost starts to increase, water supply, these are able to take some of that until you get around to the next budget year. And if you do need to address something as far as adjusting it rates, so that's the importance of these, and mitigating risk, again, the key. And then as we talk about on the electric side, same thing. One extra component on there for line 2, that power stabilization fund. So we have on the electric side, line 2, as well as line 13. So 13, again, same as the water and wastewater side, that's that operating reserve. And then the power stabilization funding, one more component on the electric side that we have from a financial factor, that targeting that we were shooting for in setting these. The same thing, just going through on the electric, again, debt service coverage was not a target that we were using in this to set these results. And now, back to this again, back to the process. So we've seen this a few times. 4-step process. We are about 3/4 of the way through this whole process then. First, we looked at how much money can we expect under current rates, what do we expect to come in? Then we looked at from this last time, what do we need? How much do we need to recover? Process now, the cost of service portion of it, that step 3 is how are these costs allocated? Who's creating the cost? So what customer classes are creating what cost through this process? We know how much we need to recover. Who do we need to recover that from? Or who's causing those costs? That's where we're at in this step. How should the money be collected? What this is going to show us once we get to the bottom of it is really a fallout between here's how much we're recovering from a revenue standpoint, and then each customer class, residential, commercial, industrial, irrigation, what is their impact on the system? How much of that cost are they creating? So that's what that'll tell us where we need adjustments, where we need to look at, who's gotten out of line. So that's the purpose of this step here, the cost of service portion. So when we're doing cost of service, 3 steps. When you're building out the system, every portion of the system, all the infrastructure has a function. It's there for something. So that's our functionalization. That's the first thing we're doing, is we're taking our costs and we're functionalizing them, because every component of the system has a function in the system. Then the second portion of that, every function has a driver on that. There's something that causes the design of that component. So you have a function, and then how do you design that function? And really the keys are your max day, your max hour, just your average day usage. The whole system is designed to something here. So that's what we're doing when we classify. And then at that point, the third step, we're just allocating costs. So when we look at the water and the wastewater side, we've broken apart different components here, but from a water standpoint and the function, these are your key functions on what you separate and you build the system to. So you build the water system to your source of supply, your pumping needs, your treatment needs, transmission and distribution, and then fire protection. Main components on what you're building the system to. So once we've separated costs there as to what they do, what each component does in the system, then we determine the drivers. All right, so when we've taken it, we've determined why it's there, why each piece of infrastructure is there, then how do we design that piece of infrastructure? Well, how do we determine what size it needs to be? So your base cost things are just built out to your average day. Just operating the system day to day, and that's how they're designed. You've got parts of your system that are designed to handle extra capacity. So they're designed to what your max day number would be, what your max hour number would be on the system. And then you got part of the system that's just there for customer costs. It's pretty much a direct pass-through on that. And then fire flow. So parts of your system to recover and make sure that you have the capacity to handle fire flow. And some examples of these, your base cost, what do you count on for just your base operating the system? Well, your chemicals. Then max day, your pumping station. Those are designed to max day cost and design. Again, max hour. Your mains, your tanks, your reservoirs, and then customer, everything, your components that deal with your customer, dealing with customer interaction, and your billing, those type of things. All that is your direct customer cost. So we have the 4 components there: your base, your max day, your max hour. Your system is designed to one of these components. And so what we've done on this is we separated costs to match those. That's what we talked about when we talked about functionalizing it based upon what it does in the system, and then classifying as to what its design characteristics are. So once we've done that, we were able to take, again, all the costs. So once we functionalized, I was trying to see what I had up here at the same time instead of staring down at my screen the whole time. So once we've gone through, we functionalize it, we spread the cost based upon what it does in the system. We've classified those functions based upon how they're designed. Then we can spread the cost to customer classes. So that's what we've done from the water side. If you'll see, if we'll go back to that results on the total operating system, the operating results of the system for the water side. Here at the bottom right here, that 6.55, that's what we have for 2024 is that 6.55%. That's the increase we need. Now you'll see we spread those costs on the allocated 2024 cost of service. That's taken those costs, the 42,616,887. Again, that's the 2024 number that you saw in the operating results. Now we spread them by customer class. Who's creating the cost? Then all we've done here is we've applied the rates to determine 2024 existing rate revenues. This is what we're actually recovering from each customer class. And the difference on those just tells us where these fall out as far as who's paying their way and who's paying their fair share. You see, from the water standpoint, 2 of them really, residential and then commercial reuse, are the ones that are under recovering right now. Not surprising. The way this usually happens, and it's been a while since NBU has done actually a full cost of service study, and that's not abnormal. So you end up doing studies, or you go through the process determining how much you need every year. Once you figure that out, okay, you increase all the customers the same amount just to make sure you're recovering your revenues that you need in order to operate your system. Well, as you continue to do that year over year, usually it's your residential customers who are growing the fastest, so they're creating the infrastructure needs. So you continue to build for your residential customers, you continue to throw more infrastructure in for residential customers. but you haven't changed the ratios. You just increased everybody 5% and 6% and 4%, and you're going through the process. Pretty soon, residential is the one that really gets out of whack through the whole process. That helps offset some of that. Sure does. Yes, sir. Sure does. It helps offset some of the inequalities. You're still going to have that 6.55% shortfall, even with the new ones, because this takes into account, your infrastructure costs that are coming in. That's what the impact fees are there. There are still some of the infrastructure renewal and replacement type of things that are not covered by the impact fees. So even with the impact fees in place, you still have that 6.55%. You still have them getting out of whack just from overall increases from past years. So this is just bringing everybody up to level in the playing field.
So
This is what it would take.
This is taking the projections at the current rates, the 2023 rates?
Yes, sir, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right, yes.
2023 rates. So if we weren't to do anything, this is what it would look like?
This is what it would look like for 2024.
Okay. But what we're trying to do is potentially change what that looks like.
Right.
For 24, 25, and 26.
And what this does here, and that's a good point, potentially, because that's the decision we have to make. What do we want to do? Do we want to get everybody back on track? Do we want to start moving things in that direction? Commercial reuse, you notice we had the two of them really. Commercial reuse out of whack, because reuse is always out of whack. Reuse is always underpaying, because reuse really costs about the same as regular water does. Now, it helps the utility because that's one less water supply that we have to deal with. However, the cost to deliver reused water is almost the same as delivering regular treated potable water. Yeah. There we go. This is the norm. Very seldom do you have a utility that's 100% cost of service. The reason you don't is because there's some residential, for example, you can get more dollars because there are more customers in the residential class. You can get more bang for your buck. So you can do a smaller percent increase to residential customers and get more money. So you may see residential paying a little more. Or in things like this, you may have hit your commercial, you may have hit your industrial a little heavier. I don't work with any utilities that are 100% cost of service. They're just not. Now, there may be some that you move in that direction, and maybe that's your intent, but as you do it 3 years from now, you're going to be out again. So you're always chasing it from that standpoint. So this is more from a cost of service standpoint. This is more to know where you're moving from, not necessarily what you have to be at 100%. It is an ongoing process, and you just don't do it. Probably the biggest thing through this whole process is doing something that NBU is already doing, which is made the decision, you've already made the decision, we're going to have every utility pay for itself. That's not the norm necessarily either. Especially when you have an electric utility, produces a whole lot more revenue than what the others are. It's a lot easier just to shove a couple $1 million from one to the other. So just the fact that you're moving in where we've made the decision, every utility is paying for its own operations, that from a stop and cross subsidies, and you didn't have it in the first place before we did this, but having no cross subsidies is a huge step for most utilities, even just from a water, wastewater standpoint, much less doing it in between classes. So it is not the norm to have every class and every utility being 100% cost of service.
Can you tell us a little bit about other services?
Other services is, majority of that on other sales is your fire hydrants. So, sir?
For construction, so
Yes. So for the
And I-
revenues you get there.
And I guess where I was going with the percentage question, I understand the distribution here, but so we're saying a 6.55%. So does that mean in 2 years, we're looking at an 18% increase? I didn't know whether we were looking really at the leveling or whether we were looking at a per year basis. And so we can go from 1 year from 6.55 to 1.29 to 1813, or am I looking at that wrong?
Let's see if we can get us back here to. Okay. So here, if you go through online.
Right, so right now, we're using the 6.55
For,
illustration, but if you run that out, those are really up and down, and I didn't know whether we would really look at the leveling part of it, or are we looking at an increase in cost potentially in 3 years
right,
of 18%?
we would be looking from a rate design standpoint, we would be looking at the leveling one. From a pure, what is the cost of service, that's where we're looking at the line 24, what exactly the shortfall is and what are the needs. So the goal with that would be to level it out. So like you pointed out, that 18%, so we're not looking at that 18% in 2 years or 3 years. So kind of level it out, get them all about the same.
So then one more question about residential and residential irrigation. We
Yes,
talked in the past about 50% of the water consumption is for irrigation. So the difference here, I mean, it's not showing 50% on revenues. Is that because we're not capturing on a metering basis, or you can't allocate accurately what the percentage actually is from a real use standpoint?
Yeah, can we get that slide back up, please? Yeah, so when you look at, if you take an NBU bill for water, right, and you compare no irrigation, just essential use, to all the water utilities in the region, between and including Austin and San Antonio, there's 13 or so. We are the lowest, the absolute lowest by a lot. And if you look at Austin and San Antonio, I think it's interesting to point them out because they've gone through what we're already going through, what we're going through now. They attempt in their essential use to stay very, very low, and they're among the lowest. But as soon as you get into irrigation volumes, they're the highest, and we're still not. In some cases, we're below average on all the others. So one of the things that I would have on my mind if I were a member of the rate advisory committee is the fact that each of our 3 utilities are an essential service. You can't go without these things, right? But within water, it's somewhat unique because there is this discretionary use, and it's irrigation. So can we get that last slide up, please? Thank you. So like Rich said, this is what you see at utilities. Utilities don't have a full cost of service recovery for each customer class because it doesn't reflect the priorities, right? So for example, if you look at residential irrigation, it's showing that it should decrease by 14%, but that's just solely based on cost of service. Like I said at the beginning, we stop here at this meeting, and then after that we go into rate design. So what we should be thinking about is, well, that's discretionary use. So what do we do about that? So obviously we're not going to decrease it, right? Because we need to because the residential class, and that's essential use, that's not irrigation, is not covering its cost. So those are the kind of thought processes that we'll get into after we go on to the next step beyond this. I'm not sure if that completely answers your question.
It does, but I would say the revenue generation from the irrigation is not 50%, so just we're not actually capturing the actual revenue generation from there, or the meters aren't there, or why is the numbers not 50%?
Why? Yeah, can we get that last slide up again? It's not because I don't like staring at myself. I just need to look at the number. Yeah, you're saying why is the residential class 22,
right,
and the irrigation is 7 million? Is that right? I don't know why the dollars are showing up that way. If you look across the year for volumes, though, the volumes are typically come out.
One reason is that
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Not every home has an irrigation meter.
right.
That's where I was going.
That's it. I'm sorry. I completely missed it. I apologize. They're required by ordinance starting in 2007.
Okay.
So everybody who got a permit for the irrigation system from 2007 forward, they have an irrigation meter. But looking backwards, yeah, I'm sorry.
And so when we do look at the tiers on residential, when we look at the tiers of usage on residential, we can pretty much tell how much is for irrigation, but it's not a separate class.
But it's an important point she's bringing up. I don't mean to belabor this, but it's an important point that you're making. Although there's no irrigation meter for many, many residential customers, the tiers are how we handle that, right? So, and what I mean by tiers is up to a certain amount of gallons, it's a certain rate. And then the next tier of gallons, it's a higher rate, that type of thing. So if you have an irrigation meter or you don't have an irrigation meter, you should be essentially seeing the same rate for essential use, if that makes sense.
So since you tier in that item 1 row, that really means that the residential recovery rate is lower than 71%. Because you're tiering up as their consumption increases. So just guessing, I mean, it could be like 50% recovery for the average resident that doesn't irrigate or have a swimming pool.
It could,
Like,
yes, for the average without taking irrigation into account.
Okay.
Yes, and that'll be part of this process as we move into the next part in actually setting those tiers, is trying to figure out, okay, are there tiers set so it captures that average usage number where it should, or does it need to be in a different tier? Tiers need to be adjusted for that very reason, to start to reflect that a little more.
Yeah, that bottom tier currently is 7,500 gallons, but that's not essential. I mean, that includes irrigation these days because over the years, many, many years, that with water efficiency fixtures in homes, even if you just don't have a new home, stuff breaks and you replace it, right? Over time, the essential use volume is more around 6,000 gallons, and others are doing that as well. So that's something we need to look at in this rate design is what is the threshold for each tier.
Ian, just out of curiosity, when did we start putting in irrigation meters as well? How long has that been going on?
In 2007, it became a requirement by ordinance.
2007?
I believe it's an ordinance, but it was 2007 when that happened.
Is usage tied to irrigation meters? Do they pay wastewater fees on that use or no?
No, if there's an irrigation meter, it's only based on the domestic meter. And if a home has only a domestic meter and no irrigation meter, their sewer volume is based on the lowest 3 months over the past 12 months, the average of the 3.
And that's the key driver on having the irrigation meters, for that very reason. That way you know it's not going back into the system. Okay. Any other, yeah, before
You
we...
don't have sewer, you have septic system. You still have 2 meters. Is it built in almost two?
If you have a septic system,
You still have 2 meters.
you would only have 1 meter. Well, if you have irrigation, yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. Anything more on the water side before we move on? Okay, with the same thing we just did then on the wastewater side. We did the same thing. Water, we functionalize it. Wastewater, we're going to functionalize it. Every component, every piece of infrastructure we have on the system is there for a reason. We talked about the ones on the water side. Really the drivers, the key drivers, the functions on the wastewater side, lift stations, our treatment costs in the collection system. Those are the key drivers that we actually build a system to from the wastewater side. And then they're designed from a volume and a customer cost and then strength of flows. So this is how we design our system. Contributed flows, I&I, those are volume costs. Inflow and infiltration, that's water coming back into the system. Line breaks, cracks in the system. So we have to account for that because just because we sell it, we still treat it even if we don't sell it. So somewhere those costs have to be accounted for. That's the inflow and infiltration. Then customer cost, straight customer billing. And then strengths, your chemical oxygen demand, total suspended solids, just measures of the strengths of the flows. How much do we have to treat and to what level we have to treat it? And that's what that is. Then we've done the same thing. So we've broken apart expenses, all the expenses based upon what is the system drivers, what is the system built for, and then what is the design of those components? How are they designed? So we've done the same thing as we did on the water side. Some examples, volume, from a classification standpoint, some of the things that are driven by volume, pumps, chlorine, your wastewater treatment plant, components there, capacity-driven factors, your collection system, your pumping, things that are driven by, from a strength standpoint, your basins, grid hoppers, other components of the treatment plant, and then just customer costs. So just some examples. These are how those costs are broken out. We've determined what the main component drivers are. We've determined how we design those components. And then we're able to, again, same as we did on the water side, separate those and allocate the cost then and the expenses, and then tie that back to actually what revenues that we're recovering. Again, that in the second column there, the $37,275,895, same number we saw from a operating results standpoint on the wastewater side for 2024. So that's our total expenses that we need to recover from rates. So we spread this apart from the residential, commercial, and the multifamily. We're still needing overall that 2.11% recovery. And you can see again, same thing as we did on the water side. Residential is really the one that's under recovering from this. This is where, end of the day, once we know it, and that's the key to this actually from a cost of service standpoint, is knowing where you're coming from, not necessarily where you have to get immediately, but just where you're standing so you can make decisions. So then a decision, same on the water side, is where do we want to be at the end of the day? How close do we want to be to cost of service? Where do we want to move? And what does that do to the customers? If you saw water was a lot bigger number to get us up to cost of service. Here it's not quite as big. End result, though, we're looking for that 2.11% total revenues. We need that $770,832 for 2024. So those are results in what we're talking about when we talk about cost of service. And then electric, you'll see, be the exact same thing, that we'll spread it through different components, different drivers on the electric side, but we're looking at end result, trying to get these answers the same way.
So the allocated cost of service, that does include all the capital, all the debt service for capital improvements and all that stuff?
Yes, sir.
And that includes the projections with the new revenues for the impact of these. I guess I don't know, I'm shocked that commercial and multifamily subsidize residential as much as it does, even taking into account the impact of these. Just surprising to me.
It's really, again, it's driven by, if you won't see those same, if we did this, if we made these adjustments, if you moved to 100% cost of service and then did the same thing 2 years from now, you wouldn't see these exact results because you brought it back. It's just little by little, it gets out of whack, and it's been a while since this full cost of service has been done. And even when it was done, doesn't mean that we brought it back to, what this shows here. So it just keeps moving a little bit more and a little bit more. And it's really how you're spending your dollars. This is not far off. This is pretty typical. Water's a little higher out of the range. It would be a little closer than that. 7%, 7.5%. That's fairly normal on that. So depending what you're trying to accomplish too. Again, I mentioned that residential, you get bigger bang for your buck. You've got more customers. You've got more usage. You've got a lot more revenues out of your residential customers. You can do a smaller increase and get more money. So if you're trying to dive in there and encourage customers, encourage commercial, encourage industrial, where you may see where the residential is carrying the load a little bit because you can get more money out of it without having to throw in that 10% increase to get the same money you can get for 4%. So it just depends on the drivers, depends on what you're trying to accomplish with this.
To that point, are the rates different based on each category?
Yes, sir.
The rates are different?
Sure. Then on the residential side, like for water, you also have other issues you're trying to take into account too. So if you're trying to do things like true conservation, if you're truly trying to get customers to slow down and quit using water, on the residential side, that's where you might get more aggressive with your rates, get them a little higher, get them to slow the usage, theoretically start to drop that usage in the upper tiers and everything, depending on the true rates that you get in there. If you get high enough, your intent is to slow that. Helps from a supply standpoint. It's avoided cost from a utility standpoint. Maybe it's 2 or 3 years before you have to spend money on plant expansions, that type of thing. So it just depends on what your goals are when you're doing the rate design.
One quick question on that point, and to comment that Ian made earlier. When you look at those tiers, how do you kind of determine where those tiers are set? Obviously, it's easy to determine average use, but how do you, Ian kind of said 7,500 now, could be 6,000. How are those determined? Or
what you try to do is usually, depending on the number of tiers you decide on, usually you have that first block. A lot of times you'll see cities, people that are doing this talk about, oh, we want to help the low income people. We want to help people on the fixed income. We want to help them in that first block. You can't dictate income based upon rates. But you can help if you're on a fixed income or something like that, we're going to set this first block, this first tier at X. If you can control your water usage, then you can control your spend. So then in that second one, say, is about where you want to hit your average usage. So it's either at the top end of that first one, really it should be in the second block is where your average usage is. So you have some freedom to do what you want to do. If you want to control your costs, if you want to control your usage, you can do it in that first block. Then the second one hits your average usage. And then above that, that's your discretionary, because you don't want to penalize people for bathing, cooking, washing clothes, that type of thing. So you want to break those apart from what would hit into, Ian mentioned, now it's kind of muddied up, and some of that where we're calling it average usage actually is turned into irrigation now. Well, then you don't want to get to the point where you're penalizing people just for doing day-to-day things that they need to do. So then you start throwing that into your third blocks and even into your fourth blocks to get more aggressive, to where if you want to water your lawn, you want to go wash your cars, things like that, well, that's okay, it's your choice, but there's a cost to that. But we don't want to penalize you just for cooking, just for living, that type of thing. So that's how you try to break those blocks up.
understanding that, but are those tiered, are those usage rates? Is that kind of something that NBU figures, or is that national averages? I assume it ties closely to the square footage of houses and a number of other factors, but where are you pulling those? You can't just pull those numbers out of thin air.
No, you break them apart just by analyzing what NBU's usages are, and usage levels and average usages, and what you want to accomplish. Again, if you want to try to provide a block, that first block where people can't control their spend, then that's how you design that. There's no average to do it across the country. Every one of them is different, and every area is going to be different, and every city is going to have a different push on flow efficiency, fixtures, that type of thing. So there's not an apples to apples across it. You're just doing it really based upon what your system does and what you want to accomplish from it.
I'm talking about the volume blocks. So like, I mean, I assume maybe you want to make it affordable for 80% of users. So you go, you know, we're going to set the first block for 80% of users. I'm just trying to figure out how you would calculate where to set those blocks, not so much the function behind them.
Not the rate, the volume in each block.
Correct.
Yeah, I'll tell you where my thinking is, just from thinking about this year after year for so many years. Used to, it was, we can pretty well average what non-irrigation essential use is. That's pretty easy to do. Not only for those customers that have an irrigation meter, we just look at their domestic meter, but you can run some analytics on those that don't have an irrigation meter to understand what is essential use. We need to get to that number. It's around, big reveal here, it's around 6,000 gallons, right? But Rich brings up a great point, right? We've never done, so I feel like we need to think about moving from 7,500 to 6,000, because that's really the number. But then Rich brings up a point that we haven't contemplated before, which is, well, do you pick a volume block below 6,000 with low income, fixed income in mind, right? Because if you can achieve that, then that's even better. And maybe maybe 6,000 and above subsidize that lower one. I don't know. But that's one of the policy areas that one of the subcommittees is taking up, which I think is terrific. And that's an idea we've never used here, and something that I'd like for us to talk about. Beyond that, though, I really don't know. I think it's all about revenue and what you can generate in revenue and what we want to do in the way of applying these costs to irrigation.
Thanks.
You bet.
Ian, I think we need another block though, for households that only have daughters. I think my bill thinks I'm irrigating, but I'm not.
How about we do that and teenagers? Okay?
What's that?
We'll do that, and we'll do teenagers.
Okay, well, I got 2 of those and my wife. I'm fearless.
Father, mother, and a couple of kids now. We're seeing a 3rd generation added into that as well, and adult children. Is that something that you've looked at?
It's a great point you're bringing up. I've had that direct question from a customer. I think it was not long ago. Hey, I have 2 families living in my house. We've got to do that. So do your rates look at that? No, they don't right now. They don't. I don't know of any other communities that are doing that, but it's something that if this committee wants to take up and provide that kind of feedback, then for sure.
Well, not necessarily a different rate because of multi-generational, but that figuring that phenomenon into the blocks that you do.
Yeah, right, absolutely. We could.
What you will see is you'll start to see your average usage going up.
Yeah,
creeping back
that's a good
up
point.
in regular season house. So your average users will start creeping back up higher, and that'll address that, because then you'll move that into a lower block, that higher number. So you start designing the blocks to incorporate 7,500 like it is now at a lower cost block instead of the 6,000 that actually is coming out. So it does address that. It somewhat writes itself if you're paying attention. Not necessarily your pocketbook all the time, but that's what you would call a sunk cost, unfortunately. Got 6 of them, I know. So 3 girls. Choices. All about choices, dang it. That is it, gang. That's from the finish up on the wastewater side, and this is what we've got coming up. Next time we do this, we'll look at the electric cost of service. Same thing that we've done here on this, and then we're moving into more of the rate part. So we'll hit, in December, we'll have 2 of them in December. One being the electric cost of service and then the public forum portion of this. And I think, Justin, that's where y'all are shooting to really wind things up and have some answers from the community. At least a little organized on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, just, let me know if there's a way I can help you, or if the NBU team can help you in facilitating your subcommittee conversations. Because in December, I believe we have 2 or 3 opportunities that NBU is going to have some public meetings on various topics. We're going to have our forum as well. And so if the public chooses to participate, we want to make that as informative as possible. And so if you haven't started and need help, please say something so we can help you out. maybe even give you some additional questions and things to think about as you go through that process. Rich, thank you again. I do.
Justin, real quick, as far as the subcommittees, it seems to me, just looking at them, that some of them, it would, if not many or all of them, it would be appropriate for NBU staff member to be present to help, answer some questions so that we could be a little bit more, come back with a little bit more information in December.
I think it could be committee by committee. If you want to engage, I mean, obviously they're more than happy to help spear that conversation, not steer, but kind of give you more to think about and answer questions you might have on the fly. You would just need to let them know if you would like someone from NBU to come to your meeting. Just let somebody on the team know that, hey, can y'all send someone?
Yeah, well, like the reserve question is a good example of where you really need someone that, with that background and information before you start, bring recommendations without more context.
Good point. All right, does anybody else have any questions? I do real quick want to recognize, I missed the mayor earlier. Rusty Barkman is here with us today, and so I wanted to come back to that. Thank you for being here with us, and if nothing else, our meeting's adjourned.